Good afternoon. I'm Macy Wilbur, and I'm here to talk to you about my Keystone, Talking Talk, a podcast about rhetoric and politics. So I decided to do my Keystone on this topic because as a public relations major and also a Spanish major, I'm really interested in the connection between communications as a field and rhetoric. Obviously, they have a lot in common, so this was really interesting to me. And just to give a short little definition, rhetoric is the study of writing or speaking as a means of communication. So to make it basic, it's the words we use when we talk or write. And so especially nowadays, rhetoric and politics there are things that we're all affected by and we all participate in. So it's extremely relevant and important. And with the rise of technology, rhetoric has changed so much. With social media, for example, I think it's very prevalent in politics that we see the change in rhetoric. So, for example, if we've seen Donald Trump's tweets, we know that the rhetoric used in those tweets tend to be more on the casual side and less complex. So it's really interesting to see how technology has changed rhetoric. Also, the actual medium of my Keystone, being a podcast, was really important to me. So podcasts as a medium are a great way to take very complex information and make it into a casual conversation and make something that uses complex rhetoric and kind of be able to use less complex rhetoric and explain it to a wider audience. So I started my Keystone by doing a literature review of core works in rhetoric and specifically rhetoric in political research and speeches. I also did a content review of academic works and non-academic works. So you can see on the side over there some examples. Dr. Kendi, who's actually a professor here at BU, published the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby. So this is a book that is non-academic and uses less complex language because it's targeted towards children. So this is a great example of non-academic political works. And I also did content review of academic works that use higher level, more complex language. So the actual podcast itself includes my own analysis of the literature and content review. It includes interviews with rhetoric, communications, and political professors, as well as audio clips from popular communicators like Carl Sagan, who's a famous science communicator, and Donald Trump, like I mentioned before. So I explore some big themes in this podcast. One of the main questions is it the responsibility of the public itself to become more educated so that they can understand complex rhetoric? Or is it the responsibility of academics to make information more accessible so that the general public can understand it? So this was really interesting to delve into, this idea of responsibility and whose responsibility is it to make this academic information more widely accessible. So some solutions that were brought up during my interviews and my analysis was, for example, simplifying complex rhetoric through journalistic means. So this is where journalists take really complex academic information and turn it into something that's more widely accessible, and they use less complex rhetoric. And this is placing the responsibility on the academics. So the academics are the ones who should make the complex rhetoric less complex. And on the other hand, if you place the responsibility on the public, you can improve education so that the general public can understand higher level rhetoric. So in this case, the actual public itself is the one taking on the responsibility so that they can understand complex rhetoric. I also explored a little bit about ethos, pathos, and logos and how academia as a whole utilizes each of these. So academia relies a lot on ethos and credibility. So a lot of times academic works will use jargon and very specific language to show that they have this knowledge of this topic. And so hand in hand, sometimes academia doesn't focus too much on pathos and that emotional side of things. And so I thought it was interesting to explore the difference of these. And also explore the specific means of this in political works. So is it important for political works to invoke an emotional response and use pathos? And if it is important, does higher level rhetoric used in academic works even have the ability to invoke an emotional response? Or does this higher level rhetoric kind of take away from that emotional impact? And I also, in the future, want to explore a little bit about the difference between written political works and oral political works. So political speeches, for example, use very different rhetoric and might be interpreted in a different way than written political academic works that might use more complex language. So I would like to really delve into that idea. And kind of going off of that, the translation of written into oral, does translating writing into a speech affect the information or the way we receive the information? So sometimes even if the rhetoric and the words we use are exactly the same, it would be interesting to see and analyze and discuss if there's a difference between how people interpret it, even if it's the same wording and the same rhetoric being used. So here is a little clip from my podcast where I'm talking with Professor Renstrom, who's a rhetoric professor here at BU, a little bit about academia.
Who are we writing for if even experts have trouble understanding the jargon, right? Like what is going on here? So yeah, I think that this is not the way to disseminate information, and it makes science or academia seem like this magical place where secret stuff happens and we will never understand it, but we just need to simply trust that whatever comes out of it is right. And I don't think that's useful or helpful.
Professor Renstrom's commentary ties perfectly into the idea of the ivory tower, which is essentially a term used to describe the world that elite academics live in. From books like Beyond the Ivory Tower by Derek Bach or Escape from the Ivory Tower by Nancy Barron, we can learn about this idea that academics speak a different language than the general population and are quote-unquote stuck in this ivory tower of theirs.
So that's just a little clip to give you an idea of what I talked about in my podcast. And I'd like to say thank you to my advisor, Professor Beth Kramer, and the other professors that I was able to interview and talk with.
So we'll take some. Great presentation. I thought that was a really cool way to talk about talk. But specifically, how did you decide to talk about politics, out of all things, when deciding to look at academics and rhetoric language?
Yeah. So I did focus in general on academia, and I talked with, for example, Professor Renstrom a little bit about science, but I focused a lot on politics, I think, because it happens in a lot of academic fields, but I think specifically in politics, there's a huge goal to reach a wide audience. So a lot of times political candidates are looking to reach the biggest audience they can and kind of explain political ideologies. So that's a really big goal of the political field. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of analyze the rhetoric and see if it actually does have this accessibility. Thanks.
I really loved the questions that you tackled in your project. I guess I was wondering, what do you see as the key to being able to integrate kind of ethos and pathos in academia? Like, is there some certain like words that people can use? Is it kind of a perception change? What would it take?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think it's a little difficult to tackle because if we're talking about specifically written academic works like political research, I think that would be a little bit more difficult to tackle and include pathos in written political academic works. So I would be interesting to see and explore some ways that academics can do that. But I think in political speeches, it's definitely something very possible to include because I think in speech we're very much more open to using different rhetoric and including pathos.
Going back to the concept of the ivory tower, how important do you think it is for people in academia to write and in a way that's able to like disseminate to the public? Because a lot of times in very niche fields where these people who have been studying like a very niche topic for so long, it's kind of difficult to write that in a way that's very available to the public. But like you were saying, it's very important to like not stand in this ivory tower. So how do you find a balance when you come to these niche fields and finding a way like that's very publicly available, but then at the same time writing in a way that respects like their expertise?
Yeah, so I actually touched that exact topic on my podcast, kind of about how some academics worry about losing specificity when you use less complex rhetoric. And I think one of the ways, for example, that was brought up was still, for example, producing a research paper using complex rhetoric, but then having journalists who go and read it and understand it and find a way to disseminate it in a less complex way. So then there are kind of both of those options. So people who do have a really great grasp of the field can read the complex rhetoric and understand it, while the wider audience can kind of have this less complex way of describing it and be able to understand that version.
Great. Well, thank you, Macy, so much.
Thank you.